And welcome back to Spinoza and Jewish Modernity, or if you missed last week, nice to see you for the first time. Last week, in part one, we explored Spinoza's biography up until 1656, when he is excommunicated from the Sephardic congregation of Amsterdam. We also kind of talked about the history of this particular community, which was a relatively novel and idiosyncratic community of Iberian New Christians turned New Jews. So we talked about both this Iberian past and also about Amsterdam in the 17th century. Spinoza's life, or at least part of it, coincides with what is often called the Dutch Golden Age of just great economic growth and productivity, coupled with tremendous art and just the great efflorescence of culture, and also Amsterdam emerging in the 17th century as compared to pretty much anywhere else in the world at this time, very tolerant in terms of allowing different groups to settle, and in the case of Jews, to practice their religion openly, and without, even some of the same restrictions that you often found on, Jewish livelihoods elsewhere in Europe at the time. Okay. So, wait, there we go. Yes, so you can see the three parts. We did Spinoza, a life, last Friday. Today, we're going to focus more on Spinoza's philosophy, and toward the end, specifically on those elements that will pose the greatest kind of challenge to the kind of foundations and underpinnings of Judaism and Jewish thought. As I mentioned last time, Spinoza died on February 21st, 1677. So today is the 348th Yortzeit of Spinoza according to the secular calendar. And then, next week for our final meeting, we will turn to the subject of not, necessarily the Spinoza of history, but the posthumous Spinoza, the Spinoza who has laid down this gauntlet that later Jewish philosophers will have to answer. The Spinoza who becomes something of a cultural phenomenon. What my former teacher, Yosef Yerushalmi, called the first culture hero of secular Jews. This trajectory, this rehabilitation from heretic to hero, including over the past century, efforts at rehabilitation that have gone so far as kind of mooting the issue of lifting the excommunication, lifting the cherem itself.
Hey
Okay.
Daniel, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. There are closed captions on the bottom of the screen. I don't know if that's intentional, but a number of people are
No.
finding them distracting. So
Oh, yeah.
if you have a way to turn them off, I think some folks would like
Sorry,
that.
guys. This better? Okay. So, just to kind of review Spinoza's life from the point of his expulsion from the Sephardic community in 1656. At this point, he's only 23. I always kind of marvel at that. I have to be honest. I think that someone would have that type of internal strength and composure, whatever one thinks about Spinoza's philosophy, to just be willing to go his own road, and go his own road he did. So what happens after Spinoza is excommunicated? As we talked about last week, this seems most scholars would agree that this was a kind of a mutual divorce. That it wasn't, so much that Spinoza was pleading with the community, to keep him. The community, the writ of excommunication even says that the community has taken all sorts of steps to try to avert this outcome. And so it's in all likelihood, Spinoza was not present, when his cherem would have been read from the bima of the Spanish Portuguese synagogue. And that, is that. So 1656 to 1661 is something of a kind of dark period in Spinoza's biography. Now, what I mean by that, it's not dark in that he's depressed or anything like that. It's just that we don't have that many reliable sources on this particular segment of his life. We know, for the most part, he is still living in Amsterdam. He seems to be part of a circle of both Dutch freethinkers and nonconformist Christians, collegians, remonstrants, Quakers, and that he's beginning to kind of almost like workshop some of his philosophical ideas within this circle. One of the works that he writes, which is in many ways seems like the first work that he writes, called The Treatise on the Improvement of the Intellect. It appears that he's beginning to publish that at this point, including as well as a work that will serve as a kind of rough draft for the ethics that's never published, that is only discovered in Dutch, the only one of Spinoza's works that we see in Dutch, because everything else he writes in Latin. So he might have begun writing that as well during this period. One interesting fact about his biography, and this is something that we only learned in the mid 20th century, when there was a French scholar who was doing research in the Portuguese archives of the Inquisition. And apparently, the Inquisition it would sometimes send agents to countries to which Iberian conversos had escaped to do some surveillance. And they would come back and write a report. So there was somebody who writes a report on going, to dinner in 1658, with some kind of wealthy Spaniard, not Jewish. And whom does he meet there? It seems that he meets Spinoza there. Actually, I should say this person was in the Jewish community, because that's part of the whole point. And so you see Spinoza there. And, okay, to think back to last time, I remember I talked about this conversa with whom he was in close contact around the same time, named Juan de Prado. So Juan de Prado managed to kind of escape being excommunicated in 1656 by effectively, copping a plea, making amends with the community. But he, was just an inveterate heretic, couldn't be repressed, and kind of ultimately, got shown the door in 1658. So it's very interesting that you would have somebody who's a member of the Sephardic community who's hosting Spinoza and Prado for dinner. We don't know much beyond that. The only thing we can say is perhaps this suggests that not everybody was following the order of the community, that nobody have anything to do with Spinoza whatsoever. Okay, moving along, 1661, he moves to Rijnspoort, which is a little town near the University of Leiden. You can see actually the house right here, which is now a museum. 1661, this is where kind of Spinoza comes into the spotlight again, because he begins a series of letters that will ultimately be published in his posthumous works. And really, this is a remarkable just body of work in terms of trying to understand, what is often called the Republic of Letters in this period. Spinoza writing to various intellectual luminaries, including figures like Leibniz, and the great German philosopher who often is seen as kind of following in Spinoza's wake, at least metaphysically. And he's also, right, people have maybe heard Spinoza was a lens grinder, and he didn't just do this to make some extra money. This was part of his interest in optics and light. But he's beginning to do this. In 1663, he publishes his first work, and the only one to which his name is attached prior to his posthumous works. And this is called The Principles of Descartes' Philosophy. And it's an interesting work in that it both is meant to be kind of a primer on Descartes' philosophical system, but already you begin to see Spinoza is kind of developing his critique of Descartes' metaphysics in particular in ways that will more fully disclose themselves in his magnum opus, The Ethics. Okay, so from 1663 to 1670, I'm sorry, 1663, he moves to Voorburg, which is a suburb of The Hague. We know that in 1665, from his letters, apparently, he had been working on the ethics, but he puts it on pause to write what will become the theological political treatise. Where he will kind of articulate this pointed challenge to Judaism and Jewish thought, but also to coercion in religion more generally. Spinoza lives during very interesting times, right? That old, maybe apocryphal Chinese curse that we find ourselves in, the year 2025 today. So many things happen in Spinoza's life, including in Jewish history, this messianic movement, this mass messianic movement that organizes around this Ottoman Jew named Shabtai Tzvi. And the year 1666, I don't have time to get into it, but this movement it spreads throughout the Jewish world like wildfire. And we know that it reaches Amsterdam. We even know that just in terms of communal minutes, that there are some wealthy trustees of the community who begin trying to dissolve their assets because they think, well, we're about to return to the Holy Land. So one of Spinoza's English correspondents, sends him a letter asking him, a lot of talk here about this Shabtai Tzvi. What are your thoughts? And unfortunately, we don't have Spinoza's answer. That would have been really a wonderful source to have. 1668, 69. And this is important just because I think it will influence Spinoza's thinking going forward. Spinoza was friends with these two brothers, Dutch brothers, whose last name was Courbach. And one of them in particular, Adrian Courbach, had written a work in Dutch in 1668-69 that was a real free-thinking work, critical of organized religion. And because he published it in Dutch, so the Reformed Church, which is the official church, they used their sway to persuade the city regents to arrest him. And he's condemned to the Rasphuis in Amsterdam, which is this infamous workhouse. Their kind of jail at the time. And, Courbach is essentially worked to death. So he dies in 69, and that is something that definitely figures in Spinoza's thinking, probably in his decision in 1670 when he publishes this Tractatus Theologico Politicus, the theological political treatise. He publishes it anonymously, He also publishes it under false imprint. So if you look actually at the frontispiece, you will see that if you look toward the bottom, it doesn't say it's published in Amsterdam. It says it's published in Hamburg. Okay, but it was never published in Hamburg. It was published in Amsterdam, and this attempt to kind of use an anonymous authorship obviously convinced nobody because already Spinoza was a figure of some suspicion, and almost immediately, Spinoza comes under unwanted limelight for having written this book. Just to summarize very briefly, in 1670, he moves to The Hague. He will live in this garret apartment in a building owned by a specific family who were called the Van den Spix. He will, over the next few years, complete the Ethics, but will not publish it during his lifetime, nor will he really publish anything else during his lifetime. He writes this study of Hebrew grammar, as well as his political treatise. 1672, there's an outbreak of a two-front war against England and France. Somebody who was Spinoza's patron, whom he looked up to a great deal, a Dutchman named Johann de Witt, who was a Republican leader who opposed monarchism. And this is a real conflict in the Dutch Republic at this time between, those who support the regents, more Republican rule, and those who want to restore the House of Orange. And so Johann de Witt is basically lynched by a mob along with his brother Cornelius, which is, he had been both a source of financial support to Spinoza, but Spinoza really had also seen him as very much somebody who kind of embodied the kind of a politics that he aspired to. So it was a great disappointment to Spinoza. 1673, Spinoza is actually invited by Karl Ludwig, who is the son of the elector of Palatine, the Palatinate in the Holy Roman Empire, to assume a chair in philosophy at the University of Heidelberg, so long as he doesn't say anything that would be critical of the official church or of the elector himself. And Spinoza, again, right, wants no part of that. So he answers politely, but says no. 1674, the states of Holland actually ban the theological political treatise. I don't have time to get into all the different groups that will ban the theological political treatise, let alone the ethics after it comes out after his death. In 1677, he dies on 348 years ago today at the age of 44. He had contracted tuberculosis the year before, could well have been related to his work grinding lenses with all the substances that are created that can interfere and infect the lungs. And so only after he dies, but later that year, you have a massive volume of what are called the opera postuma, or the posthumous works, which include the ethics and several other works, including his letters to that point. And so that really, the ethics is not published as a standalone work. It is published as part of the opera postuma. And Spinoza is buried in a grave in a churchyard, right? The churchyard of what's called the Nieuwe Kerk, or the new church. So you can see both the gravestone on the ground as well as this slab. And I don't, if you notice, if you look close, you might see this, kind of basalt, stone, on which is inscribed the Hebrew words Amcha, right? And Amcha kind of like came to me in like Yiddish. It's Hebrew, but Yiddish is like, Amcha meant are you a Jew, right? You're one of us, right? So we'll talk maybe a little bit about this next week, that on the 300th anniversary of Spinoza's Cherem in 1956, the state of Israel sent a delegation to this, whatever ceremonies were held in The Hague, and brought this uh, this stone inscription from the black volcanic rock of the state of Israel. Okay. Now, turning to Spinoza's philosophy. Now, we could devote a whole 3 sessions. We could devote a whole semester, right, to this topic. So, we're going to be dealing with it in extreme brevity, and there may be questions that arise, and just put them in the chat, and I'll try to get to them when we finish. So, what is the central idea that underpins Spinoza's philosophy for all its complexity, for all its intricacy, for all its difficulty? Okay, and this is the claim that there is a single unified substance, okay, or let's just say a single unified being that we can call Deus or Natura, God or nature, okay? In other words, all is God. And where he uses this phrase in particular in Ethics Part 4, he says, the power by which individual things preserve their being is the power itself of God or nature. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip over this for now because I want to make sure that we don't get bogged down in terms of time. But I'm happy to come back to it in terms of how Spinoza comes to this by using terminology that originates, with the ancient Greek philosophers, with Aristotle in particular, in terms of the difference between substance and attributes. A language that is later, also kind of taken on, not just by other medieval philosophers, but by Rene Descartes himself, who's often considered, right, the first, modern philosopher in terms of Western philosophy, how he will reinterpret these ideas of substance attributes and then adding modes, right? And then how Spinoza uses all three of these ideas, but tweaks Descartes' use of them in order to arrive at the view that there is only one substance, okay, that we know through two attributes that basically constitute the essence of substance. And we know two of these attributes. We know of thought, right, or essentially mind, and of extension or body. In Descartes, this was complicated because he saw mind and body as separate substances. And so, you might have heard of like the mind-body problem, the whole problem of how you have like mind and body as two separate substances, and, what brings them together? How are they conjoined, right? And so Descartes didn't really have a great answer to this, right? He had to kind of resort to a kind of providential explanation. Spinoza, by coming to the argument that there is only one substance, can basically say there is no real conjoining here, right? These are all these attributes of thought and extension, and any other attributes. There are an infinite number of attributes that exist. They are all simply attributes of the one substance. Okay, so there is no kind of real separation, at least. There's maybe a conceptual separation, but these are not two different things, mind and body. Okay, happy to come back to kind of run through this if we have time to do so. Okay, so Spinoza is what we would call a monist as opposed to a dualist as a metaphysician. A monist means that Spinoza believes there is effectively only one reality, one being. There is no kind of breach between God and nature. There is no supernaturalism. Everything is one, and there are various modes or predications of this kind of one being, God or nature. As opposed to Descartes, who is very much a dualist, there are two separate substances of mind and body. Okay, so what are some of the implications of this metaphysical monism? And you can see them listed here. Spinoza's God, right? He uses this term, and I think we have to take it seriously. But his God is not the personal, supernatural God of Judaism or any of the revealed religions. Spinoza's God isn't the creator, master, judge, or redeemer of the world and humanity. Spinoza's God doesn't form covenants with particular individuals, groups, people, states, right, or even humanity. Spinoza's God doesn't care about us, right, and is indifferent to our prayers and worship. This is an important one, okay? Spinoza's God doesn't act with will or intention. He acts only out of the ironclad necessity of his own being, right? This idea that God or nature is all that exists and acts from the same necessity with which it exists. It is more like things just kind of flow out of God, logically, conceptually, as opposed to God, actually initiating anything. And this would be a critical difference, I should just say, because with, let's say, Spinoza and other previous Jewish thinkers, be they philosophers or even mystics, right, who would often, uh, you know, be challenging or at least, arguing that there is a higher plane, on which God is to be understood that comes closer, let's say, to the God of the philosophers, and regarding some of the more kind of anthropomorphized aspects of God that we see, let's say, in the Hebrew Bible or in rabbinic literature and midrash, that, these would all have, whether they're accommodated to the kind of mentality or understanding of those who are not, truly the intellectual elite, or there's just a kind of allegorical meaning there. Right. But even figures like, let's say, a Maimonides or Gersonides, or even some mystics who would really push toward a kind of pantheism, like what we see in Spinoza, none of them would deny, right, the act that there is some kind of will with which God creates the universe, right? Because, like, without that, right, all you have is something like a kind of like Neoplatonic, great chain of being, right, where there is no kind of initial will, there is no initial kind of decision to begin the process of creation or emanation. All right, so this is very significant. Spinoza's God doesn't perform miracles as if he were some kind of like separate agent, right? Manipulating nature from without. A very famous proposition in book 1 of the Ethics, that God is the immanent, not transitive cause of all things. What this means is that, God is fully kind of within nature, right? He's not acting like externally upon nature. Okay. So for Spinoza, free will is an illusion, just as if God doesn't act with free will, right, but only out of necessity. The same is true for all human beings as well, right? All events are determined by prior events and causes, which are further determined by previous past events and causes, giving rise to an infinite chain of causes upon causes upon causes. So, we may feel ourselves to be willing our actions. Like, we may think, well, I'm making a decision to raise my arm as opposed to not raising my arm. But Spinoza would simply argue, and I don't have time right now to get into the different kind of forms of knowledge, but he would say this is a product of our imagination, which is the lowest form of knowledge. And it simply, reflects our own kind of limited, partial understanding of how things work in the world. And, he uses in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics this analogy of stone that would be falling. right, that would think I'm doing this of my own accord, right? That it's no different from holding that a falling stone could believe that it is very free and that it perseveres in its motion for no other reason that it wills so, right? So free will is a delusion. And the only substance that is entirely self caused, meaning acts from the necessity of its own being as opposed to through external causes, is God or nature. Okay. But even God or nature is not acting with free will, right? The freedom there is just that there is a totally self-caused. All right, there is nothing that is actually impinging on or imposing on or prodding being or substance to act. So, what is freedom for Spinoza? So, here we come to a different, freedom is obviously one of these, maybe essentially contested concepts, right? It's interpreted so differently by different thinkers, by different peoples at different times. Um, Spinoza's understanding of freedom is, in some ways, I would say, a kind of stoical one. And that freedom is not about acting with free will, it's not about some kind of unconditioned choice. Freedom comes through knowledge. Freedom comes through reason. Freedom comes through understanding how everything is determined, how everything is interconnected, right? And basically aligning yourself with that, right? This idea that things could have been produced by God in no other way and in no other order than they have been produced, right? So, what Spinoza would argue is that, by gaining this type of understanding, by living, we do this by living according to the guidance of reason, right? And this is our liberation, right? Part four of the ethics is famously called "On Human Bondage," right? You might have heard of the Somerset Maugham, a novel with that title that was very much based on Spinoza's ethics. We liberate ourselves from the passions, right? These emotions that basically kind of like overtake us and that move us without, our kind of acting rationally and moving ourselves, right? So, in some ways, there is a sense we can change our behavior, but we do so. It's almost like we would think of it today, almost of a kind of like rewiring, right? And that rewiring happens, in Spinoza's terms, through understanding. And there's a lot of similarities here with later psychological theories, even psychoanalysis, even cognitive behavioral therapy is somewhat similar, in terms of like challenging thought distortions and things like that. Um, but Spinoza is also arguing for freedom in the public sphere, although not, as kind of expansive a sense of freedom as, we would, perhaps uh, expect in a democracy. Spinoza is mainly agitating for the state to allow maximal freedom of thought and expression. And he even says in chapter 20, the final chapter of the Theological Political Treatise, that the purpose of the state is really freedom. Okay, so what are ethics for Spinoza, right? If ethics isn't about free will, right, something that we usually take for granted when we think about, ethics is choosing to act in a right and good manner. So the best way to explain it would be that, to borrow a little bit from Tocqueville here, that ethics is the pursuit of self-interest rightly understood. Meaning that ethics is not about self-sacrifice. It's not about commiserating with the suffering of others and trying, it's not about feeling pity. It's not about adhering to prescribed moral codes. It's a kind of egoistic ethics, right? Which is about pursuing our own advantage doing what we need to do to preserve our being and increase our power. Okay, but how do we do that? And for Spinoza, increasing our power isn't about it's not it's not the example that we see, let's say in Washington these days, right? Of trying to literally impose your will upon others, right? We enhance our power, we enhance our being when we exploit what distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom, and that is the ability to act rationally. Okay, and so when we act on the basis of reason, we come to recognize that that mutual assistance, social reciprocity, that these are essential for our individual preservation. So in other words, we come, to the act of creating a fair and just and equitable community through reason itself. And we're not just using that to fulfill our individual potential, but to contribute to the creation of a just and equitable society. And finally, what is the summum bonum? What is the greatest good for Spinoza toward the end of the Ethics, right? And here, he brings in a concept that we see in Maimonides as well, of the intellectual love of God, right? What is called the amor Dei intellectualis. And I would just explain it as, that when we gain kind of the least partial, the least perspectival, the most holistic understanding possible of the necessity and interconnectedness of all things, we come ever nearer to seeing things as God does, namely under the aspect of eternity, sub specie eternitatis, right? In other words, we understand why everything is, why everything has to be the way it is and what. And that, Spinoza argues, is what true salvation is about. That is the source of blessedness and peace, right? That is the reward in and of itself, right? The reward of kind of knowing, understanding, and then knowing that you are understanding. This intrinsic joy of understanding reality, God, or nature. And Spinoza makes clear at the very end of the Ethics that this, is only for the happy few. But this famous line with which he ends the Ethics, all things difficult are as excellent as they are rare. Okay, now to the treatise. What was called a book forged in hell by one of its critics. Actually, Stephen Nadler, the great biographer and scholar of Spinoza, used this as a title of his book about the Tractatus about 14 years ago. Okay. So here, just laying out briefly the organization of this work, with chapters 1 to 15 basically being devoted to a kind of theological and political critique of all of these issues. I'm going to, the reason I've emboldened too is that I'm going to kind of elaborate on them in particular. And then the rest, of the book is basically where Spinoza outlines his political philosophy and his vision of what should be the proper relation of religion and state. And Spinoza does embrace a kind of social contract model similar to Hobbes before him, to Locke after him. He is ultimately arguing for freedom of thought and expression, not for the freedom to live entirely the way you want to. He's still, right, in some ways, Spinoza is more concerned to bring religion under, the nose of the state rather than protecting religion from state. Okay. And he sees the sovereign as having a great deal of that we essentially, we give the sovereign a great deal of control in terms of how we can act and what we can do. But Spinoza tries to make an argument not so much based on right, but based on principle, on pragmatism, for why a state will achieve its greatest stability if it doesn't suppress opinions, but actually allows them to be aired. Okay, so to turn to two of the aspects of Spinoza's critique of religion, but of Judaism in particular, that I wanted to emphasize, in this introduction to his challenge to Judaism and Jewish thought. Now, just a little background. It was said after Spinoza's death that Spinoza had actually written back in 1656 a defense of his, defection from the synagogue, an apologia, and that the theological political treatise, or at least these chapters, are a further elaboration of this work that already existed in Nucleus. Now, we don't have any kind of extant text of this apologia, so it certainly is plausible, but not provable. So I want to talk about this chapter 3, which is called On the Calling of the Hebrews, or sometimes in previous translations, On the Divine Election of the Hebrews. And this is where Spinoza will set his sights on disproving the idea that Jews are still in any way God's chosen people, right? And he does so by redefining what chosenness would mean. That chosenness isn't a kind of spiritual principle, right? It's not about a certain kind of superiority of a religion, let alone of a culture, or race. Spinoza wouldn't even think that way, right? That chosenness solely referred to a successful political system, right? So Spinoza would say that, the Jews were chosen by God so long as they had a effective, functioning, well-run state or commonwealth. Okay, but once they lost this in antiquity, once they lost their ancient commonwealth, right? Whether first, with the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the first temple in the 6th century BCE, or eventually in the 1st century CE, with the kind of defeat of a maybe quasi-sovereign Judea by the Romans. After this point, the Jews are no longer chosen. Now, by making this claim, Spinoza was defying both kind of traditional Jewish and Christian explanations for what was seen as the mystery of Jewish survival. Right? How is it that 1600 plus years after, right, the Jews have lost their land, have lost their independence, why are they still here? Why have they survived? Right? So for Jews, right, this was, how did Jews traditionally explain this? They explained this as saying that, yes, God may have punished the Jews for their sins and exiled them as a result, right? Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. This is a passage in the Musaf service of all of the pilgrimage festivals. So God punished the Jews by exiling them, but the covenant itself had not been abrogated. The covenant itself still existed. And so, and ultimately Jews believed, right, that there would be this messianic restoration, and Jews would be stateless no more. Now, even Christians, right, while believing that they had effectively inherited this mantle of chosenness by virtue of being Israel in the spirit as opposed to Israel in the flesh, right, they too understood the survival of the Jews as a supernatural phenomenon. meaning that God had a special destiny for Jews envisioned. That if we think about maybe the most influential of all the church fathers, Saint Augustine of the fourth century, Jews were meant to serve as theological witnesses to the suffering that would befall those who had not only rejected Jesus, but who were guilty of deicide. Or Jews were to serve as what were called living letters of the law, right? They were the ones who were the kind of custodians of the Hebrew scriptures in their original, and therefore, given that Christians read, what we would call the Tanakh, or what they call the Old Testament, given as they read that as kind of predicting or prefiguring promises, that would be realized with the coming of Jesus, right? They would have the actual proof of these texts by knowing the text. And there's also ideas that Jews would be the first to convert at Jesus' second coming, right? So both Jews and Christians saw a kind of supernatural rationale for the continued survival of the Jews, right? And Spinoza says, no. Yes, they've survived, but there's nothing to wonder at. There's nothing mysterious about this whatsoever. Why are they still here? Spinoza is really the first. He doesn't use this term, okay, because it is only coined another 200 years later, roughly. But Spinoza will essentially say the Jews exist because of anti-Semitism, right? Because they have drawn the hatred of all men against themselves. And that if it weren't for this, it's a little complicated, right? He also talks here about how kind of obstinately they hold fast to certain kind of separatist rituals, singling out circumcision, which is interesting. But it seems as if the main problem is this, this external push, less than any kind of internal pull. Meaning that if you lift, if you stop mistreating the Jews, if you stop hating them, then they will in all likelihood assimilate and cease to exist. Now, there is this passage we can come back to at the very end, where he says, indeed, if the foundations of their religion did not make their hearts unmanly, right? There's something about Judaism itself, or rabbinic Judaism, that is emasculating. I would absolutely believe, perhaps connected to this idea of circumcision, I would absolutely believe that someday, given the opportunity, they would set up their state again, and God would choose them anew, meaning by virtue of creating a polity, right? They would now be chosen again. David Ben-Gurion, who was an avid Spinozist, we can talk about this next time, looked at this passage and said, you know what? Spinoza was the first Zionist. I think that is a real reach, but that is an interesting part of Spinoza's reception. Okay, I'm going to skip over talking about Spinoza's interpretation of scripture for right now, except to say that Spinoza basically argues, he's not the first, people are already beginning to read scripture more critically, but he is arguing that we need to study scripture effectively as we would study any other work. Using whatever tools of historical criticism, of what would be called philology, the study of language, and that the aim principally should be to understand what the Bible means in its own context, and not presume that the Bible is in its entirety, at least, the Word of God and therefore true. And this is how Spinoza will, in this chapter 7, really distance himself from Maimonides, right? Where he will use Maimonides as his foil, as an example of somebody who is also a rationalist like Spinoza, but who wants to kind of hold on to both the idea that the Torah is a priori true and philosophy is true, and therefore they must cohere. And so, what you do then is you reinterpret the literal sense of passages that would make no sense philosophically. Either you explain away the contradiction or you reinterpret them allegorically so that they cohere. And this is what Spinoza is pushing back against, right? Spinoza is saying we need to read it as it is and not de-imposing any kind of external philosophical frameworks. Okay, so again, I'm sorry I have run over a bit, but just to conclude, what I see as being kind of the gist of Spinoza's challenge. First of all, there is no longer a covenant between God and the Jewish people. If we think of this idea of covenant as so kind of central to Judaism, this more than chosenness itself, right? It is this idea of covenant that we have, that God is both, the God of the universe and humanity, and he is the God who has established a special pact with the Jewish people, right? Spinoza rejects this. And he doesn't say this, so baldly, but read between the lines, it's clear that post-statehood, post-Commonwealth Judaism, diasporic Judaism, simply has no reason to exist. It has no raison d'etre, right? Because Spinoza would say that the laws and practices that we find in the Torah, right? I mean, this was effectively a kind of political constitution of the ancient Israelite state, right? It's not, it wasn't, distinguished by its kind of wisdom in any respect, any kind of like philosophical illumination, right? I mean, the role of these laws, like the role of religion in general, Spinoza would argue, is to kind of serve as a kind of a spur to obedience. And so Spinoza would say that once the Jews lose their state, all of these laws, halacha, Jewish law, is obsolete. They are meant for a political entity that no longer exists, right? And so Spinoza is basically saying, if you think about a fundamental question, why be Jewish? Spinoza is saying, for no real reason at all. Okay. Now, to questions. So Jason,
Yeah,
maybe,
there are.
yeah, let me try to
There
open
have been
this chat. Yeah.
Sure. There have been a number of questions in the chat.
Maybe before you leave,
And
you just want to summarize, just like if you've seen a couple that that echo each other, maybe.
yeah, 100%. Let me just also make sure that people are able to unmute if they need to. Okay.
Mhm.
So there are, no, there are really three questions. One is practical. Can we get a PDF possibly of the slides? If that's something you're willing to do, we can talk about that later. You can, send me that, but it's totally at your discretion. And no, they're just all different ones. I mean, should we have folks unmute and ask them in order?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. So, Warren, do you want to ask your question about lens grinding? Warren Green,
Can you
I
hear
can
me?
ask it. Yeah, we hear you.
I hear you.
Now I forgot the question. Where are we?
Well, you were asking essentially why it was that
Oh yeah,
Spinoza
I'm
was a
sorry. Yeah,
lens. Yeah.
exactly. What was it about that Spinoza, if it wasn't for money, which I had thought it was, why did he get into grinding glass? What was his interest?
Well, no, I wouldn't deny that part of it, was to make a living. Although Spinoza also depended heavily on wealthy friends within his kind of circle of, free thinkers, um, or at least, nonconformist Christians, and even to some extent this Johann de Witt. He relied on kind of being subsidized. But I'm just all I'm saying is that sometimes people just see like that the fact that Spinoza became a lens grinder, right? I mean, like they'll be like, you see Spinoza, like this was actually very Jewish because like, this idea like you need to learn a trade. Um, and just also became part of his myth, right? And I'm just saying that Spinoza didn't just do this for financial reasons. I mean, you can look at his letters, right? You see, he's often talking, he's often corresponding with other people about lenses and optics and light. These are subjects of great interest to him. So that's
Okay.
all I'm saying.
Okay.
All right, and I actually have to leave a
Okay.
little early, but there are three people who I know have questions.
Okay. So what is the? Okay.
David Robin, Ben Gerson, and Martha Renicky in that order, going by the chat. So
Okay,
I
so
will
it's
leave folks with
David
that.
Robin, Ben Gerson,
Hmm.
and then Martha. Okay,
Martha. Okay,
David,
thanks so much, everyone.
bye. Yeah,
Okay, bye. See you next time.
David, unmute yourself, please.
Yes, hi. Um,
Hi.
Two things. I was reminded when you were talking about the free will and the stone falling.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wonderful quote in Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary where I forget what the name of the entry is. It's something like free will, where he talks about a leaf deciding, oh, I think now I'll go this way. Oh no, now I'll go this way as I fall. I think I'll fall to earth,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the same idea. But my question is, and I'll just read what I had written in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say anything about the relationship between Spinoza's thought and Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism? Because there does seem
Mm-hmm.
to be a lot of perhaps overlap or influence or something there.
Yeah, I mean, people, that is something that people have explored. I mean, Spinoza would not really, there's no evidence that Spinoza, knew anything about this. And, it seems, he's moving toward this kind of, monistic philosophy and this idea of a God as, all that exists, a kind of pantheism. Um, More through his interpretation, it's almost like bringing together his reading of previous philosophers, like the ancient Greek philosophers, like medieval philosophers, like Descartes, right? And in some ways, as he sees it, almost like teasing out, right? Maybe what would be the hidden teaching of some of them. And some would even say that Spinoza, and I do think this is true, that Spinoza was familiar with certain mystical works that also move in a direction of a kind of pantheism. But yes, I mean, like I said, I mean, I do think there are certain, key commonalities. I mean, right? I mean, when we're talking about the Eastern religions, it's and I don't want to I don't want to poo-poo the differences between, let's say, Hinduism and Buddhism, but in both, right? It's not about a personal God who forms a relationship with a particular people and who, issues all sorts of commandments. And right, I mean, it's just a very different. It's a different model that leads to a whole different understanding of, kind of the relationship between religion and time and history. But this idea of a kind of oneness of all being, um, yeah, I think that is definitely a continuity. Did you want to add? Perhaps you know more about this than I do.
No, no, thanks. I just wondered what thoughts you might have on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then it was Ben Gerson, please.
Well, it's probably a half-baked question because I didn't have very much time to reflect on it. But I'll just read you what I wrote, which relates to what appears to be Spinoza's purely materialist explanation for Jews' separateness and its relationship to statehood. If Jews' understanding of their chosenness, unlike Spinoza's, is unrelated to their loss of statehood, what explains the rise of Zionism within the Jewish community?
Can you repeat the question? Because I just want to make sure I understand it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hope I understand it. If Jews' understanding of their
Well, let's try to understand together.
okay, if Jews' understanding of their chosenness,
Mm-hmm.
unlike Spinoza's, is
Mm-hmm.
unrelated to their loss of statehood. In other words, it's for internal religious.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What explains the rise of Zionism, the desire for the establishment of a Jewish state after many centuries within the Jewish community?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's a very good question. And obviously, my reading of Spinoza's passage here is, um, he's kind of like just tossing it off as a possibility of his thought without believing it likely or even endorsing it, right? It seems clear from other passages in Spinoza, especially chapter 20 of the Theological Political Treatise, where he praises the cosmopolitanism and freedom of Amsterdam to the hilt, right? Even beyond the level of praise that it deserves, right? But it seems that would have been much more Spinoza's vision. Now, I think that what Spinoza would say is that now his understanding of religion may be a little bit, we might say, limited, but if you think back to that passage, right? If I can get back to it, hold on, right? No. Right. So let's just look at it again, right? If the foundations of their religion did not make their hearts unmanly, right? Which I see as meaning that, if Jews want to reclaim their statehood, if they want to reclaim sovereignty, if they want to reclaim independence, they're gonna have to break with certain foundations of their religion, which I think here he would associate with a kind of emasculation, or maybe a passivity, right? In other words, let's just say what was in some ways the standard kind of posture in terms of this, vision of redemption, right? Which is that, God, would send his Messiah to liberate the Jews from their exile, when God was ready to do so. In other words, still a kind of supernatural vision, and one, which doesn't really require Jews themselves to assume agency. So I would say that, Zionism, when it emerges as a movement, a national movement in the 19th century, first of all, most of the founders of Zionism are secular. And, we might look at some of their secularism even, right? The kind of secularism of the pioneers during the second Aliyah, the third Aliyah, as, sometimes awash in kind of religious feeling and motifs. But, they saw themselves very much as breaking with Jewish law. They saw themselves as breaking with Jewish messianism because they associated it with passivity. So, perhaps that, would be the answer, that it was about a kind of agency that would require a more secular as opposed to religious mindset. Okay. Okay. Martha.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't write my question because I on a tablet and it's really hard to type. So my question has to do with, I'm just taking notes on my laptop. One of the last comments where you were describing how Spinoza sees it's a continuation of the last question, but closer to the end of your lecture, no reason for diaspora Judaism, and the laws have become obsolete, designed for a specific political state. So my field is psychoanalytic theory. I'm not a clinician. I'm a theorist. And I read a lot about intergenerational transmission of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, the most prominent discussions are with intergenerational transmission of trauma from the children of Holocaust survivors, and also in terms of African American survival from slavery. And when Spinoza describes this obsolescence, it's what I heard myself saying was, there's nothing to see here, right? That he's describing a diaspora situation, which obviously was traumatic and intergenerational for the Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam, even though there was not an immediate generational knowledge of that. And he's just saying the way there's no trauma here to see, because the occasion for Judaism is just gone. The laws are obsolete. The practices are emasculating. Has anyone written about Spinoza's he protests too much? Like, there's nothing to see here. It's all fine. About how there might have been, this is his way of working out that trauma?
Really interesting question. Well, first of all, let's say that, if we accept this idea of intergenerational trauma, that could help explain why this community would have been so traumatized by Spinoza's heresy. I say that in some ways it's like kind of leading us into next week, when we will see kind of all these attempts to, bring Spinoza back into the fold as part of a rethinking of what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be a Jewish thinker? What are Jewish values? And, sometimes I think that those discussions, in the desire to kind of bring Spinoza home, so to speak, we don't appreciate just how much of a threat that he would have been perceived as in his own time, and quite rightly. But you're making an even more interesting claim that, like, when you say he doth protest so much, that is this Spinoza's own response to the trauma he himself bears? Obviously, I'm not capable of answering that question. You might look at a book that was written about 20 around 20 years ago by an author, cum philosopher named Rebecca Goldstein, that was called Betraying Spinoza. She doesn't use quite the language that you did, but she does see Spinoza's philosophy, which attempts in her mind to really diminish the importance of identity as, in some ways, his attempt to kind of get past not just the Inquisition itself, but this perennial kind of battle between religions over who is right and who is wrong. And maybe we could extend that to say, yes, it was his way, right, of escaping that trauma. I mean, if I had more time, there's a letter, we don't get much from Spinoza about what, yes, he doesn't convert. But does that mean that he still sees himself as Jewish in any kind of meaningful, existential, or affirmative sense, as later Jewish secularists would? I've always been pretty skeptical of this. But there is an interesting letter that he writes in response to one of his former tutees who now wants to convert him to Catholicism. And what he writes is part of his, rather, he's offended. And he's also a little bit like, kind of, who are you, kid? But one thing that, that the student cites is the history of martyrdom, among Catholics. And he essentially argues, Jews, they have their own history of martyrdom, and even talks about one Spanish Jew, who maybe was known in the community, but we don't know, who had been burnt, in one of these autos de fe held by the Inquisition, right? And this memory of his reciting the Shema Yisrael as his life expired. I see this as, to some extent, hinting at the idea that actually martyrdom isn't really, that there's something impressive, but also it's not the best use of our energies. But like, there could be ways in which you would read that letter and see, perhaps, is there still some kind of internal pride over things like that? Okay, I have to cut things off now, both because it is 1:12 and because I have to take my daughter to the orthodontist. But I hope that I will see all of you at our final meeting next Friday, when we talk about, do a kind of post-mortem for Spinoza, looking at Spinoza's Jewish afterlives. All right, I will see you then. Have a good week.